Britain has been tainted by the dark shadow of notorious gangs that have left a lasting mark on its history. Throughout the decades, the UK has witnessed the rise and fall of criminal organisations that operated with ruthless efficiency and brutal tactics. These gangs have controlled vast territories, engaged in violent feuds, and built illicit empires that challenged law enforcement and terrorized communities. The Sabini Gang, led by Charles Darby Sabini, was a prominent criminal organisation in London, particularly active from the 1920s through the late 1940s. They were central figures in the racecourse wars, exploiting the lucrative racecourse protection rackets, which involved extorting money from bookmakers at various racecourses across southern England. The gang, primarily composed of members of Italian descent, also engaged in various other criminal activities, including extortion, theft, and operating nightclubs. Their operations were sophisticated, involving not just local thugs, but also imported Sicilian gunmen, and they were notorious for their use of violence, particularly razor attacks, to maintain control over their territories. Sabini's gang held significant influence and had connections reaching high into the political and law enforcement spheres, which allowed them to operate with a degree of impunity. However, their reign was not without challenges. They faced intense rivalry from other gangs, including the Birmingham Boys and the Courtesy Brothers, leading to numerous violent confrontations. The onset of World War II marked a turning point for Charles Sabini and his gang. In 1940, following Italy's declaration of war against Britain, Sabini was interned as an enemy alien and later faced imprisonment on other charges. The post-war era saw the disintegration of their power as other criminal figures took over their operations. The Peaky Blinders were a notorious street gang based in Birmingham, England, predominantly active during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Emblematic of the violent street culture fostered by the city's rapid industrialisation, the gang carved a niche in Birmingham's criminal underworld through petty crimes, street brawls, and frequent altercations with local police. Distinguished by their tailored clothing and peaked caps, they became a significant part of the broader wave of gang activity, responding to the urban challenges of the time. Their criminal activities extended beyond mere brawling, to include petty thefts, armed robberies, and involvement in the local illegal betting scene. Their aggressive tactics not only targeted rival gangs, but also innocent civilians, earning them a fearsome reputation across Birmingham. This reputation was further cemented by their practice of constable baiting, where gang members would deliberately provoke and attack police officers, contributing to a pervasive sense of lawlessness in districts like Small Heath. As the turn of the century approached, the landscape of organised crime began to shift. The emergence of more structured criminal groups, coupled with enhanced policing strategies, led to the decline of the Peaky Blinders' influence. By the early 20th century, other gangs such as the Birmingham Boys began to dominate, pushing the Peaky Blinders to the fringes of Birmingham's gang scene. Despite their eventual decline, the legacy of the Peaky Blinders has endured, largely due to their distinctive style and the brutal nature of their operations. Their story offers a vivid glimpse into the challenges of urban life and the social upheaval experienced in England during this transformative period. The history of the Peaky Blinders not only reflects the harsh realities of street gang culture, but also illustrates the broader socio-economic changes that shaped early 20th century Britain. The Cray Twins, Ronald and Reginald Cray, are perhaps the most legendary figures in the history of British organised crime. Operating in the 1950s and 1960s, they led The Firm, a criminal gang that exerted considerable control over East London's underworld. Their criminal activities included protection rackets, armed robbery, and arson, but they were most infamous for their brutal enforcement tactics and involvement in several murders. The twins leveraged their gangster celebrity status to enter the nightclub business, which allowed them to mix with prominent figures from entertainment and politics, thereby increasing their influence. These clubs became hubs for their criminal operations, offering a glamorous facade that concealed their illicit activities. Notably, their connections allowed them to maintain a degree of protection from law enforcement, as they cultivated relationships with corrupt officials. Violence was a hallmark of the Cray's regime. One of the most notorious events associated with the Crays was the murder of George Cornell by Ronnie Cray. Cornell, a member of a rival gang, was shot dead in the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. An act of violence that was both a personal vendetta and a public assertion of dominance. This brazen act of violence in a public setting marked a significant turning point in public and police perception of the Crays. Despite their criminal enterprises, the Crays were also known for their paradoxical charm and were part of London's swinging 60s scene. They rubbed shoulders with celebrities and were even photographed by famous photographers, adding to their mythic status. However, their reign came to an abrupt end when they were arrested in 1968. The evidence collected over the years was substantial, leading to their conviction and life sentences for murder among other crimes. Their trial and subsequent imprisonment were widely publicised, marking the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in British history. The Richardson Gang, led by brothers Charlie and Eddie Richardson, was a notorious criminal group based in South London during the 1960s. Known as the Torture Gang, they were infamous for their extremely violent and sadistic methods, which included torture techniques like pulling teeth with pliers, cutting off toes with bolt cutters, and nailing victims to the floor. These brutal tactics earned them a reputation as some of London's most fearsome gangsters, surpassing even their rivals, the Cray Twins, in terms of sheer brutality. The Richardsons' fierce rivalry with the Cray Twins, who dominated the East End of London, was marked by mutual distrust and sporadic violent confrontations. This rivalry underpinned the fragmented nature of London's criminal underworld, as both gangs vied for control over illegal activities, including protection rackets and gambling dens. Operating legitimate businesses as fronts, the gang engaged in fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. One of their operations was the Peckford Scrap Metal Company, which served as a cover for their underworld dealings. They also orchestrated elaborate fraud schemes known as long firms, setting up seemingly legitimate businesses to build credit before absconding with the goods or money. The downfall of the Richardson Gang came after a series of police investigations and trials, most notably the torture trial in 1967, where evidence of their heinous acts was brought to light. Both Charlie and Eddie Richardson were convicted and received long prison sentences for their crimes, marking the end of their reign over South London's criminal landscape. The Lyons and Daniel crime families are two of the most notorious gangs in Glasgow, Scotland, whose violent feud has spanned over 2 decades, shaping much of the city's underworld activity. The origins of their conflict date back to 2001, when a significant consignment of cocaine belonging to the Daniel family was stolen by the Lyons and sold. This act ignited a violent turf war over drug territory and control of lucrative criminal enterprises. The Lyons crime family, led by Stephen Lyons, is involved in a range of organised crime activities, including drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, and violence. They have extended their operations beyond the UK, establishing connections in Spain and the United Arab Emirates. The family is known for their brutal enforcement tactics and high-profile crimes, such as the murder of Kevin Gerbil Carroll in 2010, which was a significant event in their ongoing feud with the Daniels. The Daniel crime family, their rivals, have also been deeply involved in the Glasgow underworld, engaging in similar activities. The rivalry between these two families has led to numerous violent incidents, including shootings and assaults, significantly impacting public safety in Glasgow. For instance, the 2006 murder of a Lyons family member at an MOT station and the 2010 assassination of Kevin Carroll in an Asda car park are some of the most publicized events in this feud. Over the years, this conflict has seen both sides employing extreme measures, including shootings outside primary schools and other public places, creating a climate of fear in the community. Despite numerous arrests and convictions, including the sentencing of 6 Lions gang members to a combined 104 years in prison, the feud has shown little sign of abating. Both families have sustained significant losses, but the cycle of violence continues to perpetuate as each side seeks to maintain control and save face within the criminal underworld. The Nunan brothers, Desmond, Dessie, Dominic and Damien, were infamous figures in Manchester's criminal underworld from the 1980s to the early 2000s. The family, originally specialising in armed robbery, eventually dominated Manchester's nightclubs and drug trade, particularly during the height of the acid house scene in the late 1980s and 1990s. The Nunan brothers first rose to prominence following the 1991 gangland murder of Anthony White Tony Johnson, leader of the rival Cheetham Hill Gang. Although Desmond Nunan was charged with Johnson's murder, he was later acquitted. Over the years, the Nunan family was linked to at least 25 gangland murders and numerous other crimes. They controlled nightclub security across many of England's major cities, amassing significant wealth from their criminal enterprises. Dominic and Desmond Nunan were known for their brutal enforcement tactics. Desmond, in particular, was known for his violent methods and served as an enforcer and hitman. The brothers' control over Manchester's club scene, including the legendary Hacienda nightclub, allowed them to rake in huge profits from the drug trade, reportedly making up to $50,000 a night. Their criminal empire began to crumble after a series of significant events. In 2004, Damien Nunan died in a motorcycle accident while on holiday in the Dominican Republic. This was followed by Desmond Nunan's murder in 2005, when he was stabbed by a crack dealer known as Yardie Derrick. These events significantly weakened the family's control and influence in the underworld. Dominic Nunan continued to be a prominent figure in Manchester's criminal scene, but was plagued by legal troubles. In 2016, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison for arson, blackmail, and perverting the course of justice. In 2018, he received an additional 11-year sentence for historical sex offences against underaged males, ensuring he would spend most of his adult life behind bars. The Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson Crew are 2 of Birmingham's most notorious gangs, with a history marked by violence and intense rivalry. Both gangs emerged in the mid-1980s, initially formed by local youths in response to external threats from more established Jamaican gangs, often referred to as Yardies. The Burger Bar Boys originated from the Handsworth and Winson Green areas, taking their name from the Soho Road Burger Bar where they used to meet. As crack cocaine became more prevalent, the gang's activities escalated in both scope and violence. They engaged in drug trafficking, extortion, and numerous violent crimes. One former gang member noted that many of the boys pulling the trigger were not expert marksmen, which often resulted in indiscriminate violence. The Johnson Crew, named after Johnson's Cafe in Lozells, were based in Lozells, Aston, Netchells, Newtown, and Erdington areas. Initially formed to combat white supremacist groups, they soon turned their focus to battling the Yardies and expanding their control over Birmingham's drug trade. By the mid-1990s, they had established a reputation for brutal violence, mirroring and often surpassing the Yardies' tactics. The rivalry between the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson Crew is deeply rooted in both personal and territorial conflicts. Over time, many involved in both gangs were former friends or acquaintances who split due to increasing tensions and conflicts over drug territories. This rivalry resulted in a series of tit-for-tat shootings, which escalated into a full-blown gang war by the late 1990s and early 2000s. One of the most infamous incidents highlighting the brutality of this feud was the 2003 murders of innocent teenage girls Letitia Shakespeare and Charlene Ellis, who were caught in a drive-by shooting intended for rival gang members. This event brought national attention to the extent of gang violence in Birmingham and marked a turning point in police efforts to tackle gang-related crime. The response to the gang violence in Birmingham involved significant police operations, including undercover work and community interventions. In 1997, the police arrested several high-ranking members of the Johnson crew following the murder of DJ Jason Wharton, which led to successful convictions despite initial community resistance to cooperate with law enforcement. Despite these efforts, the feud between the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew has proven resilient, continuing to affect Birmingham communities. Both gangs have evolved over the years, maintaining their influence and adapting their operations in response to law enforcement actions. The Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, also known as the Addams Family or the A-Team, is one of the most powerful and notorious criminal organisations in the United Kingdom. The syndicate was founded by the Addams brothers, Terry, Tommy and Patrick, or Patsy in the 1980s, operating primarily out of the Clerkenwell area in London. The Addams brothers began their criminal careers extorting money from traders and stall holders in local markets before moving on to armed robberies. Terry Addams emerged as the strategic leader, Tommy handled the financial operations, and Patsy provided the muscle. Their transition into the drug trade during the mid-1980s marked a significant shift as they capitalised on the booming demand for cocaine and cannabis. This move allowed them to amass considerable wealth and expand their influence. The syndicate's activities have included drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, and murder. They have been linked to at least 25 organised crime-related deaths. The gang also engaged in sophisticated money laundering operations, using various businesses, including those in the Hatton Garden Jewellery District, to clean their illicit earnings. Notably, Tommy Addams established international connections with other criminal organisations, further expanding their reach and operational capabilities. The Addams family has been involved in numerous high-profile criminal cases. For instance, in the late 1980s, the murder of accountant Terry Gooderham and his girlfriend in Epping Forest was attributed to the Addams syndicate. The brothers have faced several legal challenges over the years, with Terry Addams being convicted of money laundering in 2007 and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Despite claims of financial hardship, he was later ordered to pay substantial amounts under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Despite numerous convictions and ongoing police investigations, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate remains influential. Their ability to adapt and maintain operations over decades highlights their resilience and the deep entrenchment of their criminal activities within the UK's underworld. The Yardies, a term originally referring to Jamaican gangsters, emerged as a significant force in the UK's criminal landscape during the late 1980s and 1990s. The name Yardie is derived from the Jamaican patois term for home or yard, often referencing the crowded housing complexes in Kingston, Jamaica. Yardie gangs became notorious for their involvement in violent crime, particularly gun-related incidents and the drug trade, notably marijuana and crack cocaine. Yardie gangs began establishing their presence in the UK during the 1980s, initially focusing on London before expanding to other major cities such as Birmingham, Bristol, and Manchester. Their arrival was marked by a significant increase in gun violence, which was relatively uncommon in the UK at the time. The Yardies brought with them a reputation for ruthless violence, often using firearms in conflicts over drug territory and other criminal enterprises. One of the most notorious incidents involving the Yardies was the murder of Police Constable Patrick Dunn in 1993. Dunn was shot while responding to a disturbance in Clapham, highlighting the extreme violence associated with Yardie operations. The police response included the establishment of specialised units like Operation Trident, aimed at tackling gun crime within black communities. Despite these efforts, Yardie gangs continued to exert influence, often using brutal methods to maintain control over their territories. While the influence of traditional Yardie gangs has waned in recent years, their impact on the UK's criminal landscape remains significant. The initial wave of Jamaican gangsters left a legacy of violent tactics and drug trafficking operations that have been adopted and adapted by subsequent generations of British-born criminals. The hybrid nature of modern gang culture in the UK, which blends elements of Jamaican, British and American gangsterism, owes much to the original Yardie influence. The legacy of the Yardies in the UK is one of enduring notoriety. Their activities in the 1980s and 1990s reshaped the landscape of organised crime, introducing a level of violence that had a lasting impact on law enforcement and community safety strategies. From the streets of London to the alleys of Birmingham and Glasgow, we've uncovered the dark and tumultuous history of Britain's most feared criminal organisations. These gangs, with their ruthless tactics and indomitable influence, have left an indelible mark on the nation's criminal landscape. Their stories of power, rivalry, and violence remind us of the complex and often brutal nature of organised crime.